Lucas Hanley, a 42-year-old prosecutor in the city of Rivercrest, stood on the threshold of his office. Tall and confident, he was accustomed to being the person people turned to for help in complex legal situations. His workday was coming to an end, and he felt the pleasant exhaustion that comes with closing a case. Over the past 10 years, Lucas had earned a reputation as a principled, honest, and, unusually for his field, incorruptible professional. His primary motivation was always justice, and he believed that even an imperfect system could serve society if one fought for it. But Lucas was not just a prosecutor. He was a black man who grew up in an underprivileged neighborhood. His family had struggled with poverty for many years, and Lucas himself faced racial discrimination during his teenage years. These memories steeled his character and guided him toward the path of law. In his profession, he saw an opportunity to change the system from within to make it fairer. However, he understood that to many people, even his colleagues, he was no more than an exception to the rule, a black prosecutor who had supposedly gotten lucky. As evening fell, Lucas left the courthouse and headed to his car. His small gray, while not a symbol of success, reflected his practicality. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had no desire for ostentatious luxury. The car was comfortable, reliable, and enough for him. He turned on a podcast about legal system reform that he had been meaning to listen to for some time, and set off for home. His route passed through one of Rivercrest's residential neighborhoods, where silence and peace prevailed. Lucas knew this neighborhood well. It was predominantly home to middle-class white families, many of whom were familiar with him due to his community work. Despite this, he always felt a slight tension as he drove through these streets. He was used to noticing glances from windows, glances that often conveyed a mix of curiosity and wariness. Perhaps it was just an echo of his own experiences, but Lucas could not shake the feeling that he was still an outsider here. As he drove a few blocks, bright headlights flashed in his rearview mirror. Red and blue police lights pierced the darkness. Lucas felt an uncomfortable pressure in his chest. He knew he had done nothing wrong. His speed was below the limit, and all his documents were in order. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and rolled down the window. The cold night air seeped into the car. The police car stopped behind him, and after a few seconds, Lucas noticed someone in uniform approaching his car. It was Officer Rachel Carson, a young white woman with a stern expression. Her steps were confident but devoid of friendliness. She approached Lucas's car but did not introduce herself. Instead, her gaze scanned the car, Lucas's face, and then settled on his hands resting on the steering wheel. Lucas felt a familiar sense of helplessness wash over him. He had spent years defending the law and yet found himself in a situation where his race seemed to dictate how he would be treated. The officer gestured for him to lower the window further. Her eyes grew more cautious when she noticed a folder of documents on the passenger seat. The calm Lucas tried to maintain began to fade as the officer ordered him to step out of the car. Her tone was strict, as if he were already guilty. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cool air against his skin. The officer inspected his car without explaining the reason for the stop. His figure stood out against the dark vehicle. In his gray suit, which he wore in court, Lucas looked completely out of place as a suspect. Yet the officer's expression suggested otherwise. She motioned for him to place his hands on the hood. Lucas complied, trying to maintain outward composure, though inside indignation boiled. As the officer searched the vehicle, neighbors began peeking out of their windows. People Lucas had only seen in passing were now watching him. Their silhouettes behind curtains made him feel humiliated. He didn't need to hear their conversations to know what they were discussing. He knew how easily people could believe the worst about someone like him. Even here, in a neighborhood where he was known as an honest and upstanding citizen, his skin made him a suspect. The stop dragged on. The officer claimed that Lucas's car matched the description of a vehicle involved in a robbery. Despite the absurdity of the situation, she continued to act as if she was sure of his guilt. To Lucas, It felt like he was back in his youth when he had been detained simply for walking in his neighborhood at the wrong time of day. After some time, another patrol car arrived at the scene. Out stepped Captain Jack Martinson, tall with graying temples, looking irritated. After a brief conversation with the officer, he approached Lucas and, without hiding his annoyance, asked him to return to his car. The stop was over, but the bitterness remained. As Lucas got back behind the wheel, he felt drained. He didn't need to explain to himself what had just happened. It wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. It was a systemic problem that poisoned everything he was trying to achieve. He returned home late that evening but couldn't sleep. One question echoed in his mind. If even he, a prosecutor, was not protected from such treatment, what about those who lacked the knowledge or status to stand up to the system? That night marked the beginning of a long journey for him, a journey that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others. The next morning, Lucas Hanley woke up with a heaviness that hadn't left him since the incident. Usually, he began his day with his usual routine: breakfast, the news, a quick review of his cases. But today, everything felt different. He felt drained, even though the night had been quiet. A growing unease filled him, one he could no longer ignore. Something more significant than a simple misunderstanding was happening around him, and the feeling became increasingly clear. Lucas headed to the office earlier than usual. Once at his desk, he didn't immediately dive into his routine tasks. His gaze lingered on a folder of cases, but his thoughts kept returning to the events of the previous night. He began sorting through documents, but realized with each passing minute that his attention was consumed by something else. It was a systemic problem that demanded attention. He decided to start by analyzing statistics. He had access to databases containing reports of arrests and court cases. Lucas focused on incidents similar to what had happened to him. He entered keywords related to suspected vehicle theft to find cases in the areas he had driven through the previous night. Soon, numerous records appeared on the screen, and he began to study them carefully. The results were troubling. Most arrests occurred in specific parts of the city, predominantly in areas inhabited by low-income residents or minorities. Moreover, 70% of those arrested in these neighborhoods were black drivers, even though their share of the local population was significantly smaller. Notably, most cases ended without charges being filed, but the process of being detained left people humiliated and traumatized. This pointed to a pattern Lucas could not ignore. Next, he delved into court cases to examine the consequences of these arrests. Many individuals who ended up in the system opted for plea deals to avoid lengthy and costly trials. This reinforced Lucas's suspicions. The police seemed to act not to ensure order, but to exert pressure on certain groups of people. By evening, Lucas began looking for connections between neighborhoods with high arrest rates and other events occurring in those areas. Recalling recent protests against illegal construction projects, he decided to cross-reference arrest zones with areas of active construction. Using available city data, he noticed a disturbing trend. Most arrests occurred near sites linked to major developers. One such company was Vernon Engineering. Lucas was well aware of its reputation. The company had repeatedly been the subject of investigations for environmental violations and the use of cheap labor. Now it seemed its activities overlapped with police practices. In areas where residents expressed dissatisfaction with construction projects, police acted with particular harshness. This was no coincidence. Digging deeper, Lucas discovered that many of the arrests coincided with complaints about Vernon Engineering's actions. Police reports indicated that officers regularly patrolled these neighborhoods, calling it security measures. However, when analyzing the data, Lucas noticed that no real threats had been recorded in these areas. This was further evidence that the police might have been used to suppress local dissent. By the end of the day, Lucas felt a growing unease. All the data pointed to the existence of a system that used the police to protect corporate interests. This wasn't outright corruption, but the traces of bias and manipulation were too clear to ignore. He felt he was on the verge of uncovering something significant, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed evidence that could withstand a trial or a public investigation. Night found him still at his desk. The office was silent, broken only by the clicks of his mouse and the rustle of papers. In front of him lay printouts, charts, and maps he was trying to organize. This wasn't just a professional task. For Lucas, it had become a personal mission. He realized he was confronting systemic discrimination, and he couldn't leave it unchallenged. The city where he had worked his entire career had revealed its flaws. Lucas knew a difficult path lay ahead. Any attempt to challenge the system could have consequences for his reputation, but remaining silent would be even more unacceptable to him. The following week, Lucas Hanley fully immersed himself in his investigation. The data he had gathered on arrests and their connection to Vernon Engineering's interests formed a fragmented yet troubling picture. Each new discovery only confirmed his suspicions. The police were not just acting with bias. They might have been deliberately protecting the corporation's interests. Lucas began to notice strange things. One evening, as he was leaving the office, he felt someone watching him. Shadows in the parking lot moved too quickly, and the sound of footsteps fell silent whenever he turned his head. The next morning, he found an unsigned note on his car windshield. "Drop this. For your own good." He slowly folded it and tucked it into his pocket, feeling a rising unease. However, Lucas knew he couldn't stop. He decided to look into past cases involving Vernon Engineering to understand how deeply the corporation might be entwined with the city's affairs. Old cases of safety violations on construction sites surfaced, some of which had received widespread media attention. Several protests against illegal construction in minority-heavy neighborhoods had ended in mass arrests. Data showed that these protests were often suppressed by police under the pretext of ensuring public safety. In the city court archives, Lucas found a 3-year-old lawsuit in which the company had been accused of environmental violations. At one site, a toxic spill had contaminated a local water source near a predominantly black neighborhood. Residents filed a class action lawsuit, but the case was abruptly dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Court records from the presiding judge mentioned suspicious reports of missing documents related to the lab tests. This case was a glaring example. It confirmed that the corporation's interests had long been protected at the expense of those whose voices were systematically ignored. Moreover, Lucas discovered a record indicating that Vernon Engineering had donated a substantial sum to the local police support fund at the time. While not direct proof of corruption, it strongly suggested a mutually beneficial relationship between the corporation and law enforcement. Engrossed in his work, Lucas didn't immediately notice how his name began to circulate more frequently in professional circles. At a prosecutor's council meeting midweek, colleagues started asking him strange questions. One senior prosecutor, known for his conservative stance, hinted that Lucas was getting too involved in matters outside his jurisdiction. This comment was no accident. Lucas understood that someone was trying to warn him. The warning signs multiplied. A few old acquaintances stopped returning his calls. Information he had requested from the police regarding recent arrests suddenly became unavailable. His requests were denied without explanation, and one police station outright told him they were no longer obligated to provide such data without a court order. Amid all this, Lucas received a letter in the mail. It was printed on cheap paper, and the text resembled an official protocol, as if written by someone accustomed to formal language. The letter stated, "We know what you're doing. Don't confuse your interests with matters above your level." Lucas maintained his composure, but placed the letter in a secure location, along with the other evidence he had gathered. His assistant, Kira Elliott, also sensed the change. Twice that week, she noticed unfamiliar people sitting in a car parked across from the office, never getting out and staring at the building. She cautiously shared her concerns with Lucas, but didn't get a specific response. Lucas knew that discussing these threats with her or anyone else would put them in danger. By midweek, Lucas decided to delve deeper into the connection between arrests and construction sites. He turned to city maps and analyzed where the arrests had occurred. The results were alarming. The areas where police raids took place coincided with territories where Vernon Engineering had begun or planned construction projects. Furthermore, some of the protests suppressed by police had been organized by local residents trying to stop illegal construction. One case stood out in particular: the arrest of a group of activists protesting the demolition of an old residential building in a poor neighborhood. The building had housed generations of African American families, and its demolition sparked outrage. Despite a lack of evidence of any criminal activity by the protesters, police arrested several individuals, including a young mother and her brother. Police reports claimed they posed a threat to public order. A month later, construction of a luxury complex owned by Vernon Engineering began on the site. Lucas understood that all these events were connected, but he still lacked direct evidence. He needed a way to uncover more without putting himself in greater danger. Yet he felt he was under constant surveillance. Threats, strange coincidences, and the wariness of those around him made him tread cautiously. Late at night in his office, he pored over old court records and reports, feeling the pressure mounting. Despite this, he had no intention of backing down. His motivation went beyond professional obligations. He couldn't turn a blind eye to the ways an unjust system continued to oppress and discriminate against people like him in favor of those with money and power. This week had been a wake-up call for Lucas. The system he had begun to challenge wasn't going to let him go quietly. But he was ready for it. This wasn't just a fight for the truth, it was a fight for his own place in a world that refused to accept him as an equal. A few days later, Lucas Hanley realized that the boundaries of his investigation were beginning to blur. Each new discovery, every confirmation of the connection between Vernon Engineering, the police, and city authorities, added layers of complexity to an already tangled web. But one thing became clear. He had stumbled upon something far beyond mere abuses of power. This was a system where authorities, business, and law enforcement worked as a single entity to advance their interests, suppressing any signs of resistance. In his work, Lucas was no stranger to challenges, but now he felt he had stepped into dangerous territory. The threats became more sophisticated. Someone sent him a letter with words cut out from newspapers, like something out of a blackmail film. The message read, "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into." It was a cheap attempt at intimidation, but the goal was clear: to make him stop. Lucas didn't give in to fear. On the contrary, it strengthened his resolve. He delved deeper into cases involving Vernon Engineering and found that most of them were resolved unusually quickly. The company had been accused multiple times of violating safety protocols and environmental standards, but these cases were either dismissed by judges or dropped due to a lack of evidence. It all looked like a meticulously orchestrated scheme. Over the past 5 years, the company had tripled its capital, winning a series of government contracts despite its questionable reputation. One case particularly caught his attention: the construction of a new residential complex in the eastern part of Rivercrest. This project sparked a wave of protests from local residents, mostly African Americans, who feared the construction would displace their families. The police intervened, dispersing the protesters, after which the project was approved unanimously at a city council meeting. Deputy Mayor Douglas Crane, who actively lobbied for the company's interests, was present at the meeting. Lucas began to suspect that Crane might be the key link in this scheme. When Lucas dug into the company's financial reports, he found several suspicious transactions. Large sums of money had been transferred to the accounts of small firms registered to members of Crane's family. This could have been a coincidence, but Lucas knew that in politics and business, coincidences were rarely accidental. He decided it was time to expand his investigation. Kira Elliott, his dedicated assistant, continued to help him gather evidence. She suggested comparing police patrol data with the timeline of Vernon Engineering's construction projects. The results were staggering. Police raids most frequently occurred in areas where protests against the company were starting. It looked like a well-oiled mechanism. The police were being used to suppress dissent, ensuring the company could operate without obstacles. One key incident stood out. Several residents of a neighborhood tried to file a lawsuit against the company, accusing it of the illegal demolition of a historic building. The lawsuit never reached court because all the plaintiffs were suddenly arrested on charges of disturbing the peace. Lucas found a copy of the complaint filed by the residents and discovered that the attorney representing them had been forced to withdraw from the case after his office was subjected to a tax audit. These findings painted a cohesive picture. However, Lucas was missing one crucial piece, a reliable witness who could confirm his conclusions. He knew that documents and data were valuable, but without personal testimony, his evidence could easily be contested in court or dismissed by the public. At that point, Kira approached Lucas with a lead. She mentioned a contact of hers, Michael Trent, who had once worked in the city planning department, but was fired after questioning suspicious contracts involving Vernon Engineering. Michael agreed to meet Lucas, but only under the condition of anonymity. The meeting took place in the evening at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Michael was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder and speaking in a near whisper as he recounted what he had seen. He confirmed that city officials had repeatedly turned a blind eye to the company's violations because of pressure from the top. He mentioned meetings between Vernon Engineering representatives and Douglas Crane, held behind closed doors. According to Michael, these meetings often resulted in quick contract approvals and the dismissal of resident complaints. Michael also mentioned that he had once seen a strange document outlining the distribution of financial flows between the company and interested parties. He wasn't able to photograph the document, but remembered a few names, including not only Crane, but also several high-ranking police officials. After the meeting, Lucas felt he was finally getting closer to the truth. He had data, financial reports, arrest statistics, and Michael's testimony, all pointing to a large-scale conspiracy. But he knew it was too early to take this to court. He needed more evidence to shield himself from attacks by the corporation and its allies. Nevertheless, he knew he had taken the first step in the right direction. This was more than just an investigation. It was a fight for truth in a system inherently stacked against people like him. But Lucas wasn't going to stop. His goal was becoming clearer: to expose those who used their power to oppress others and to show the city that justice could still prevail. Following the publication of initial findings about alleged corruption and racial bias within the police force, Lucas Hanley found himself at the center of a scandal. Instead of the support he had hoped for, he faced an unexpected wave of alienation. Colleagues who once respected him for his professionalism began to avoid him, and some even openly questioned his integrity. Rumors spread quickly. Among his peers, there was talk that Lucas had supposedly used his position to manipulate cases and draw attention to himself. To those not privy to the details, it all seemed like a failed publicity stunt. Even his friends began to distance themselves, afraid of jeopardizing their own reputations. Lucas felt as though the world he had known and worked in was crumbling around him. One day, as he sat at his desk trying to focus on his remaining cases, the door to his office unexpectedly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Officer Rachel Carson, the same officer who had pulled him over weeks ago. Her presence was unusual. She looked nervous, but there was a sense of determination in her eyes. Lucas gestured for her to come in, though her appearance filled him with unease. She didn't sit down but remained standing near the door, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Her words were brief and direct. She revealed that on the night she stopped Lucas, she had been given a direct order to find a reason to detain him. The order came from one of her superiors, who claimed it was in the interest of public safety. However, after Lucas's name appeared in the news, she began questioning the legitimacy of her actions. Her words were shocking, but not surprising. Lucas had long suspected that the incident wasn't a coincidence. hearing it confirmed firsthand, forced him to reevaluate everything that had happened. Rachel admitted that she had been tormented by guilt ever since, and now wanted to help expose those who were using the police for their own agendas. Lucas hesitated. He knew that collaborating with a police officer who had previously acted against him was risky, but her sincerity seemed genuine. He decided to take a chance and accepted her offer. They agreed that she would provide access to internal department documents that could shed light on the connections between the police and Vernon Engineering. That evening, Lucas met with his neighbor, Joanna Meyer, a renowned human rights attorney. Her support became an unexpected glimmer of hope in this difficult time. Joanna was already aware of Lucas's struggles and offered her contacts in the media community. She suggested reaching out to Keith Rand, an investigative journalist with experience exposing major corruption schemes. Keith agreed to meet with them the following day. During their meeting at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, he listened intently as Lucas and Joanna outlined their findings. Taking detailed notes, Keith quickly grasped the significance of their evidence. Lucas shared his discoveries and the potential new information Rachel could provide. Keith proposed using his platform to make the materials public before those behind the scheme could destroy them. However, before handing over the documents, Lucas insisted on thorough verification. Any mistake could jeopardize their entire effort. He knew that, with every step, they were getting closer to a dangerous threshold, but it was too late to turn back. By this point, Lucas found himself in a situation where every decision carried risk. He was surrounded by people whose motives he couldn't always predict and was under constant scrutiny. Yet deep down, he knew this was the only path forward. More difficult decisions lay ahead, but he was prepared to face them with dignity. The work of Lucas Hanley, Kira Elliott, and Joanna Meyer entered a critical phase. They had gathered evidence confirming the connection between Vernon Engineering, the police, and local authorities. With each piece of evidence, their investigation edged closer to a moment that could change everything. They handed over key documents to Keith Rand, an experienced investigative journalist who immediately began preparing a series of articles for publication. However, time was running out. The corporation was clearly beginning to sense the threat. Despite their caution, word of the group's activities began to leak. Lucas noticed strange behavior with his phones. Calls were cut off, and emails failed to reach their recipients. Rumors spread throughout the city, alleging that he was using his position for personal gain. These rumors were clearly intended to undermine his reputation. On the eve of the press conference, Keith warned Lucas that their actions had alarmed powerful figures. He had received several cryptic messages from unnamed sources, strongly hinting that he should stop the publication. But Keith refused to back down, insisting that the materials had to be made public. The next day, journalists, activists, and Rivercrest residents gathered in a small conference room at City Hall after hearing about the event through social media. The tension in the room was palpable. Lucas, Kira, and Joanna meticulously prepared to present their evidence and explain how the system was working against the community. Lucas began his speech by laying out the key facts. He detailed how Vernon Engineering had used the police to suppress protests and intimidate residents. He presented documents showing ties between the corporation and high-ranking officials, along with data on raids carried out to protect the company's interests. A heavy silence fell over the room. Journalists took notes, and cameras captured every moment. But everything changed in an instant. The conference room doors burst open, and a group of police officers stormed in. Leading them was Captain Jack Martinson, well known for his loyalty to the establishment. He loudly announced that they had a warrant to arrest Lucas Hanley on charges of forgery and fraud. The room erupted in outrage. Journalists shouted questions, and activists voiced their anger. Ignoring the chaos, the officers moved toward Lucas. He remained calm, though a storm of anger and fear churned inside him. He knew this was a calculated attempt to discredit him and derail his exposé. As the officers placed handcuffs on him, Kira and Joanna sprang into action. They had prepared a contingency plan in case things went awry. Kira connected her laptop to the projector, already set up for the presentation, and began streaming their data live through a popular online platform. Joanna took over explaining the documents, reading their contents aloud into the microphone. The improvised plan worked. The live stream quickly attracted thousands of viewers who began sharing it across social media. The documents Kira and Joanna managed to show became public knowledge. Among them were records of payments to high-ranking police officers, contracts with Vernon Engineering, and raid schedules that aligned with the company's activities. As police escorted Lucas out of the room, protests began erupting in the streets of Rivercrest. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, demanding a transparent investigation and Lucas's release. His name became a symbol of the fight against corruption and injustice. Social media flooded with hashtags supporting him, and footage from the press conference spread nationwide. That evening, Keith Rand published his first article based on Lucas's materials. He emphasized that the arrest was an attempt to silence a man who was trying to reveal the truth. The article detailed the key findings and included statements from those who supported Lucas. Despite the arrest, Lucas knew their team had achieved its first major victory. The documents were now public, and there was no way to bury them. However, he also understood that an even more challenging fight lay ahead. The powers they were up against wouldn't give up easily, and the consequences of the press conference could be unpredictable. In the holding cell where he was temporarily detained, Lucas reflected on the day's events. It had been a turning point. He had done everything in his power to make the truth known. Now the future of Rivercrest lay in the hands of those willing to fight for justice. The uproar following the press conference, Lucas Hanley's arrest, and the leaked evidence triggered a wave of public outrage in Rivercrest. The day after the events, thousands of people surrounded City Hall, demanding transparency and justice. Social media, national news outlets, and independent journalists amplified the story, turning it into a symbol of the fight against corruption and discrimination. Under such pressure, the authorities could no longer ignore the scandal. The state governor publicly announced the launch of an official investigation to uncover the extent of the corruption involving Vernon Engineering, the police, and the city administration. This announcement calmed the protesters, but Lucas knew that real change would require much more than empty promises. A few days later, Deputy Mayor Douglas Crane, one of the investigation's key figures, was arrested on charges of bribery and abuse of power. Documents published by Keith Rand confirmed that Crane had used his influence to lobby for Vernon Engineering's interests, receiving large sums of money through offshore accounts. His arrest marked the first tangible result of Lucas and his team's efforts. Soon after Crane's arrest, a series of resignations and dismissals shook the police department. Several high-ranking officers mentioned in the published documents resigned, hoping to avoid prosecution. However, the public demanded answers. Citizens wanted not only to see those responsible punished, but also to address the system that had allowed such schemes to exist. Despite these successes, Vernon Engineering continued to deny any wrongdoing. The company's leadership claimed that all accusations were baseless and politically motivated. They attempted to shift the blame onto a few rogue employees who had allegedly acted without the knowledge of senior management. This strategy aimed to minimize the damage to the company's reputation, but Lucas knew the truth would eventually surface. Lucas also recognized that exposing the corruption was just the first step. Preventing such situations from recurring required systemic reforms. He began working on creating a coalition that could propose real changes to city and state policies. He brought together lawyers, activists, journalists, and even honest police officers who wanted to restore their profession's integrity. One of the coalition's primary objectives was to push for legislation promoting transparency in government contracts. The proposed law required full disclosure of all contractors involved in bids and the implementation of strict monitoring of financial transactions. Lucas knew this initiative would face resistance, but without it, any other fight against corruption would be meaningless. Another key focus was police reform. Lucas proposed mandatory anti-bias training, improved internal oversight processes, and the establishment of an independent body to investigate complaints against law enforcement. He also advocated for requiring independent observers to be present during police operations in low-income neighborhoods. As the coalition progressed, Lucas encountered a new challenge. Many of the people who had previously supported him were hesitant about such radical changes. They feared the new laws might lead to reduced police funding or create difficulties for local businesses. Lucas knew his task was not only to expose problems, but also to convince people of the need for change. He began speaking to local communities, explaining why reforms were necessary not just for the system's victims, but for the entire city. His speeches, backed by facts and delivered with sincerity, attracted an increasing number of supporters. He reminded people that justice was not merely about punishing the guilty, but about creating conditions where such injustices could never happen again. Kira and Joanna continued to stand by Lucas. Kira managed logistics and liaised with community organizations, while Joanna coordinated the legal aspects of the coalition's proposals. They understood their work had only just begun, but felt that, for the first time in a long while, they had a real chance to effect change. By the end of the month, the state governor held a press conference to announce his support for the Transparency Bill and the commencement of police reforms. This marked the coalition's first significant victory and a personal milestone for Lucas. However, he knew the road to comprehensive change would be long and difficult. That evening, Lucas stood on the rooftop of the building where their meeting had been held, gazing out at the city lights. He understood that new challenges awaited him. Corruption and injustice, as he now knew, did not disappear easily. But he also realized that with every step forward and every ally gained, the city grew closer to becoming a place where justice was not just a word, but a reality. Several months had passed since the scandal surrounding Vernon Engineering rocked Rivercrest. The city had changed. The arrests of high-ranking officials and police officers, the reforms initiated under public pressure, and the open discussion about systemic discrimination marked a turning point in the city's history. But for Lucas Hanley, it was just the first step. He realized that his role as a prosecutor no longer allowed him to fight the issues he was determined to eradicate effectively. Despite the ongoing changes, the system remained too rigid for the deep reforms he deemed necessary. The decision came unexpectedly, but it felt right. Lucas decided to step down. At a small press conference in the city center, attended by journalists and residents, he announced his decision. His voice was calm but resolute. He stated that he wanted to dedicate himself to creating an organization that would defend the rights of the voiceless, combat corruption, and drive real change. Thus, the Rivercrest Civic Initiative was born. The organization's goal was to address legislative gaps that allowed corruption to thrive, ensure transparency in governance, and promote human rights initiatives. Lucas understood that the journey would be long, but he knew that this time he would be free from bureaucratic constraints. The team that formed around him shared his vision. Kira Elliott became the public relations coordinator and a key organizer of events. Her insight and energy inspired those around her. Joanna Meyer assumed the role of legal advisor, using her expertise to develop new initiatives and protect the organization from potential threats. The most unexpected addition to the team was former police officer Rachel Carson. After the scandal, she left the department, realizing she could no longer be part of a system used to oppress people. She now worked on programs aimed at restoring trust between the police and the communities she once patrolled. Rachel became a bridge between activists and honest officers who sought change. In a short time, the initiative gained attention from both local and national media. They organized a series of workshops where residents could share their stories of injustice. These meetings became not only a platform for discussion, but also a symbol of unity in a city once divided. However, the work was far from smooth. Many powerful individuals, whose interests had been harmed by the revelations, sought to discredit the new organization. Newspapers published articles accusing Lucas of using the initiative for personal gain. Social media posts mocked his actions, yet the team remained steadfast. Each attack only strengthened their resolve. The culmination came at a rally organized by the initiative in the city park. Thousands of Rivercrest residents gathered to support the wave of change. The atmosphere was charged with energy and hope. Lucas took the stage, his face reflecting a mix of exhaustion and inspiration. He began his speech by recalling how it all started, with an unjust traffic stop. But then he shifted to the heart of the matter, the importance of ensuring every voice is heard. He spoke about how change begins with small actions and the courage to speak out against injustice. At one point, he noticed a young couple in the crowd. They stood a bit apart, holding hands, with a sign that read, "We're proud of you, Lucas." His heart swelled with gratitude. He didn't know them, but he understood that their presence wasn't just a gesture of support for him personally. It was a symbol that his work had given people hope. When his speech ended, the crowd erupted in applause. People shouted words of thanks and encouragement. Lucas felt that this moment was the culmination of all his efforts, but also the beginning of a new journey. He knew that the fight for justice was more than exposing corruption. It was an ongoing process that required patience, perseverance, and unity. But in that moment, looking at the gathered crowd, he was confident that Rivercrest was moving in the right direction. As the sun began to set, bathing the park in golden light, Lucas Hanley stood on the stage, surrounded by his team. A long and challenging road lay ahead, but he felt he had everything he needed to change the future. And now he knew for certain, even the smallest spark could ignite the fire of change.